Friday, we were learning about the reason why we have the tefillos. Why do we have the prayers? It's either the avos, the patriarchs, established the prayers. And so Abraham established Shacharis, Yitzchak established Mincha, and Jacob established Ma'ariv, the night service. And then we had another opinion. And the other opinion was that the prayers are in place of the sacrifices. So we had two opinions, and then we said it's actually there's a brisa that says one way and another brisa that says the other way. So each of these rabbis who said their views has a source. One has a source in one brisa, the other one has a source in the other brisa. So they both seem to have sources from a brisa. Brisa is a statement from the rabbis of the Mishnah. And so there seems to be two sources for the prayers, either the patriarchs or the sacrifices. And we said, even though at night there is no sacrifice, but there is, the fats are burned after the sacrifice was sacrificed. During the day, the fats in the limbs are burned on the altar, and that is the night service is in place of those fats and those limbs. And we said also that the Musaf service, the Musaf prayer, is in place of the Musaf sacrifice. And then we talked about the early mincha and the later mincha, the mincha gedola, the large mincha, and the shorter mincha, the mincha ketana. These two minchas are they're time periods in the day. There's the earlier time period of mincha gedola, which means it's the earliest time possible to bring the afternoon service, the afternoon sacrifice. It's a very large amount of time in the day, from a little afternoon, half hour afternoon, till night. That would be the mincha gedola. And then you have the mincha ketana, the smaller time for mincha, and that is the time of 9.5 hours in the day until the end of the day, until the 12 hours. Every day is 12 hours and every night is 12 hours. So when we say it's 9.5 hours into the day, it means 9.5 hours until night, which means until 12 hours, because every day is considered 12 hours. And therefore 9.5 hours is 2.5 hours before the end of the day. That's called the mincha ketana. So we did mention that there is a concept of flag on mincha, halfway through mincha. And our Gemara initially questioned which mincha is halfway through. Is it halfway through the large mincha, or was it halfway through the smaller mincha? And the conclusion was that it's halfway through the smaller mincha, and therefore it's 10 3/4 hours into the day, which means an hour and a quarter before the end of the day. That is the plag hamincha, and that was Rebbe Yehuda's opinion. I heard a story of the Kloisenberger Rebbe was davening by in Eretz Yisrael in Sfas, near the grave of Rebbe Yehuda Bar Ilai. And for some reason, in the Chassidim, they want daven mincha there. So they daven mincha. And for some reason, they saw the Kloisenberger Rebbe, their Rebbe, they saw him like very disturbed. He seemed very upset. And then the next day, he said, I want to go back to Rebbe Yehuda Bar Ilai's grave. We're going to daven mincha there again. So they went back to Rebbe Yehuda Bar Ilai's kever, his grave, and they davened mincha there another time. This time, he seemed very happy. So the students, the Chassidim, they asked him, what happened? Why were you so upset yesterday when we davened mincha at Rebbe Yehuda Bar Ilai's grave? You didn't look so happy. He said, because we were davening close to Shkia. It was near sunset. And Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you're not supposed to daven mincha then. It's already time for Ma'ariv. After Plag HaMincha, it's already time for Ma'ariv. So we were in the grave of the Rabbi Yehuda of the Gemara, and we were davening mincha not according to his opinion. So he said, I felt very upset. We were not following his view right at his gravesite. Therefore, the next day I went back there and we davened mincha much earlier, so we were fulfilling Rabbi Yehuda's view. So this is the view of Rabbi Yehuda, that you have only until Plag HaMincha to daven mincha. That means that Rabbi Yehuda has a much earlier time, a much earlier deadline for mincha, and that is called Plag HaMincha, and that's 10 3/4 hours before the end of the day. And that's really where we got up to. Yeah, Susan, you have a question?
Yes. Has it ever been established when nightfall, when actually night is? How many hours?
Well, we know that night, the definite night begins when the stars come out, and it's a 12-hour night. And before that there's a gray area called Bein Hashmashos.
Okay.
It's an in-between area. It's a gray area. And we're not sure if it's considered night, what that during that period. And we try to finish mincha before that time period. That's questionable.
That was a question.
Therefore, we generally will daven mincha before sunset, and then we'll wait about a half hour and daven Ma'ariv. Now, if you live in a big city, you will not see stars when we daven Ma'ariv. Right. You will not see stars out. So how do we daven Ma'ariv if there's no stars out?
Time has to be time.
Because we're in a city where you don't see the stars until very, very late. Right. But if you were in the campground without any street lights, you would see stars at that time. So just because we live in this city, it doesn't mean it's not night. In other words, we live in a city with street lights, so we aren't going to see the stars as early as we daven. We're going to daven because what we're davening is relying on the fact that the stars are visible to someone. If this area would not have all these lights here, you would actually see stars. You would see the stars, and you would know that it's definitely night.
Okay, thank you.
That basically covers the cover all grounds for mincha and for Ma'ariv. You daven mincha in its proper time. You daven Ma'ariv in its proper time, and you wait. You have to wait. You're stuck waiting about a half hour in the middle. So this way you get around any gray area. You're not entering any doubt. No doubt. You definitely daven mincha properly, and you definitely daven Ma'ariv properly. But there are synagogues that don't do that. There are shuls that will daven Ma'ariv early, and they'll tell you, make sure to remember to say the Shema again later on because you said it too early. And even it's not necessarily so preferable what they do, but it's accepted. It's not preferable, but some places you have no choice because the community will not hang around and to do the Ma'ariv in its proper, perfect time, preferable time. And therefore they get, that it's acceptable. There are sources that it's acceptable. So they're relying on, reliable sources. Okay. So that is the idea of Plag HaMincha that we mentioned. Now, the Gemara asks a very surprising question, and I'll let you think about why it's, in other words, you could ask a good question on this Talmudic question. So let's see if anyone comes up with the question. The Gemara now, we are 7 lines up from the bottom of the page, 26b, 7 lines up from the bottom of the page. Nema tehavi tiyuvte. Let's say that this is going to prove Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Chanina wrong. Tiyufta means it proves him wrong. let's think about what Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said that the patriarchs established the prayers. Tefillos avos tiknum. The tefillos, the prayers, were established by the patriarchs. That was Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina's point. The Gemara then brought a brisa, an earlier source, that mentioned that idea, that Abraham established Shacharis, Yitzchak established Mincha. It mentioned that in a brisa. Then the Gemara brought a brisa for the other view. Who was the other view? Reb Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said the prayers are in place, are established, corresponding to the sacrifices. He doesn't say the patriarchs, he says the sacrifices. They're corresponding to the sacrifices. Now, the Gemara then brought a brisa, which also showed his point. And the brisa emphasized the different times of the prayers, and it fit with the sacrifices. So it seems that we have two brisas. One fits with Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and the other one fits with Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. And now the Gemara says, you remember that brisa that fit with Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? You remember that brisa? That brisa proves Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina wrong. Because that brisa says the prayers are corresponding to the sacrifices, and Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said that the prayers were established by the patriarchs. So the Gemara says, let's say this proves him wrong. This proves Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina wrong. Is anyone comfortable with that question? Or anyone uncomfortable with that question? Does it sound like a good point? Are we proving Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina wrong from a brisa? Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said that the patriarchs established the prayers. A brisa that we just learned and went over says that the prayers are corresponding to the sacrifices. Does that seem to be a contradiction? Yes, Ben.
I think brisas can conflict each other if they both have their own sources.
Right. You can have two brisas that argue. They're two different rabbis who are teaching two different. They're allowed to argue on each other. And we have two brisas. And then we have two rabbis that are after the brisas, called the Amoraim. And these two rabbis argue with each other, and they both have a source. They both have a brisa that seems to fit. So why would the Gemara say, how could this rabbi say something that contradicts a brisa? He has a source, the other brisa. His source is the other brisa. It's not a problem. What does the Gemara mean? That this is we're going to prove him wrong. He's got a good source. He's got the other brisa to be his source. So one of the commentaries explained. Yes.
Was already decided.
I can't hear you. Say that again. Ben, do you want to say that again?
The halacha was already decided.
Well, they're not really discussing
was
halacha.
Was the halacha decided already?
They're not really discussing halacha.
I know, but the reason that
over here they're talking about the meaning behind it. They're not talking about really a difference in halacha. So they're really just discussing the establishment of the prayers. So it's not exactly even a halach. At least at this point, we don't see any specific halachic difference between the two. The Gemara is not developing that. If there is any halachic difference, the Gemara is really just discussing what's the source of it. And so it is a little surprising that the Gemara asked this question. So to answer this, one of the commentaries explains, it says, if you look at the two brisas, there is a difference between the two. The brisa that says that the patriarchs established the prayers, that brisa really does not say that the patriarchs made it a rule for everyone to follow. They established it for themselves. They made a tradition. They started a tradition, a custom to do this. They became accustomed to do it. But it doesn't say that they made a rule for all of their future generations that they're obligated to do it. They did it. They started it. They started something. The other brisa talks about the prayers. The Shacharis prayer is corresponding to the sacrifice. So the second brisa seems to be much more of an obligation, telling us what our prayers correspond to. The first brisa seems to just mention that the patriarchs did certain prayers, but it's not clearly telling us that our prayers are based on the patriarchs. And therefore, the Gemara understands the second brisa to be a major source, a much clearer source, a much more definite source, an absolute source for our prayers. The first brisa does not really say that our prayers are connected to the patriarchs. It just says that the patriarchs did start this. Now we happen to, of course, we know that we do a morning prayer and an afternoon prayer, but it's not that the patriarchs were the ones who established it for us. They established it for themselves. They did it. They started saying a morning prayer. The Yitzchak started an afternoon prayer. The second brisa says this is that our prayers are all connected, correspond to the sacrifices. So the Gemara says that seems to prove Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina's statement wrong, because Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina emphasized that it's like our prayers are because of the patriarchs. That's pretty much clear from the brisa that that's not so. Our prayers are really corresponding to the sacrifices, and not like Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina said. So that's what the Gemara's question is, that this brisa seems to prove Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina wrong. Amar lach Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. We're now 7 lines up from the bottom of the page. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina will tell you that it's not a contradiction. And what is his answer? Li'olam emalach. Forever I will tell you, tfilos avos tiknum. The prayers the patriarchs established. Bias mechinhu rabbanon akarbanis, and the rabbis lean them on the karbanis, on the sacrifices. The rabbis relied them on the sacrifices. And that is meaning it's some type of a merge between the patriarchs' prayers, who initiated them, and the rabbis who established them and connected them to the sacrifices. The Eloi Temahachi, because if you're not going to say this, Tfilas Musaf Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina Man Tikna, the prayer of Musaf, according to Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, who established it. We only have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 3 patriarchs. They made Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv. Who made Musaf on the holidays? Who established that? It must be that the prayers are connected to the sacrifices. It's true the patriarchs established them. And the rabbis, they connected them with the sacrifices. They added certain rules similar to the sacrifices, and therefore the brisa that talks about the sacrifices, it fits with Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, because Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina does not disagree. He does not disagree with the fact that they're connected to the sacrifices, but he says that the initial establishment was the patriarchs, and it's really both. Patriarchs established them, and the rabbis, when they saw the rabbis they connected them with the sacrifices and made the certain rules, the certain time limits, and so on, based on the sacrifices. That is the rules of the prayers. Okay, so that concludes this Gemara. What comes out is that even Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, that holds the prayers were established by the patriarchs, they are also corresponding to the sacrifices. Yes, Susan.
It says in the Steinfeld, when a frequent practice and an infrequent practice clash, the frequent practice takes precedence precedence.
Yeah,
over
you're on page 27A, right?
Yes,
Okay, well, I'm on 26B.
but isn't this what you're talking about?
No, I'm not up to there yet. You're ahead of me.
I'm very confused.
We are on 26B, and all we were talking about was the source of the prayers, who established them. That's all we were talking about.
That's all. Okay.
Yep. And we concluded that there are two views, and there's the view that the prayers were established by the rabbis based on the sacrifices, and then there's another view that they were initiated by the patriarchs and then connected to the sacrifices.
Okay.
Those are the two views. And now we're up to the next Gemara. We're still on 26B, so you might want to turn the page backwards. We're now 4 lines up from the bottom of the page. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Omer Ad Arba Shos. Rabbi Yehuda says,
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes. Sure.
If the sacrifices, the prayers are corresponding to the sacrifices, so I've heard that there's the tummy, the continuous sacrifices. There's the morning one and then the afternoon one. The morning one, there begins all the sacrifices of the day, whatever takes place. And the afternoon one is the very, very last sacrifice. No sacrifices can be brought after that. So my question is, where did Marv come from? If you're waiting till 3 stars come out and the very last sacrifice of the entire day is the afternoon sacrifice, which ends the sacrifices. It has to be done during daytime.
Right.
So how did they get to an evening sacrifice when the stars come out, when there's no sacrifices past sunset? I'm assuming. So sunset is the marker.
Right. So the Gemara explained. We did the brisa that we were talking about. If you look at the beginning of the wide lines, maybe the 4th wide line. You see the 4th wide line in front of you?
I don't have wide lines. I have Rabbi.
You have
Rabbi Steinsaltz.
Okay. So it says Evarim upadarim shaloi nesachlu, the limbs and the fats that were not consumed miba'erev from before evening, krevim v'hoilchim kol halayla. They are brought all night. And that is the source of the night service. Tfilas ha'erev. The night service has no set time. Because of those limbs, that is what it corresponds to. It corresponds to those limbs.
So those limbs weren't sacrifices. They were remnants of the sacrifices.
Right. In other words, there's the slaughtering and the sprinkling of the blood. Those are the main parts of the sacrifices, mainly the sprinkling of the blood and so on. And there's 4 main services in a sacrifice: Zrika, Kabbalah, Hava'ah, and Shchita. Shchita is the slaughtering. Kabbalah is receiving the blood. Hailacha is bringing the blood to the altar, and then Zrika is sprinkling the blood. So those are the 4 main parts of a sacrifice. But after you do the sprinkling of the blood, then you have to actually burn certain parts of the sacrifice. Or in a case of an oila, like the daily sacrifice, it was completely burned. Besides for the skin, it was completely burned on the altar, and that was done. That was after the main part of the set. So the sacrifice had to be brought before night, but the burning of the limbs and the fats, that could be done all night. So the sprinkling of the blood, the slaughtering, that's the minchas service corresponds to the actual sacrificing and sprinkling of the blood. I should mention sprinkling of the blood is one of the it would probably be considered, if there was one service that's the main one, it would probably be the sprinkling of the blood that overrides all the others. But that's the mincha, and then the Ma'ariv service is the fats and the limbs that were brought depending on the sacrifice. Some sacrifices, like a oila, had much more of the limbs being burnt. The other sacrifices had mainly the fats that were burned. The oila is considered a kolil, it's completely burned. So that's the that's the meaning of Meir. Now now that you mentioned that, I should mention that Tosfos is bothered over here with the fact that where does Rabbi Yehuda get his view that you can only daven mincha until plag ha-mincha, halfway through mincha? If the prayers are in place of the sacrifices, so the rabbis, we understand them. They're talking about, according to the letter of the law, when can you bring the afternoon sacrifice? The afternoon sacrifice can be brought from a half-hour afternoon, mincha gedola, from the half-hour afternoon, 6.5 hours into the day, until the end of the day. It makes sense. That's the time you can bring the afternoon sacrifice, and that's the time for mincha. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? No, you got to finish the sacrifice by when? Plag ha-mincha, halfway through the later mincha, which is 10 3/4 hours of the day. Tosfos says, what does that have to do with the sacrifices? Where do you find the concept of plag ha-mincha when it comes to sacrifices? Sacrifices you bring before 10 3/4 hours of the day. If you want to know when the practical time they would actually bring it, they would generally bring it, the sacrifice, right by mincha ketana, right at the beginning or the end of there's a time period of 9.5 hours of the day. That would probably be the end of the mincha. They would finish bringing the mincha at the mincha ketana time. That was the norm. So if Rabbi Yehuda would have said that, when you have until to daven mincha, until 9.5 hours of the day, until mincha ketana, that would be understood, Tosfos says. Then I would understand Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Because, when the practical time they brought the mincha, it finished by that time, 9.5 hours of the day. That's why you could only daven mincha until then. That would be okay. But Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you get an extra 1.25 hours, halfway through the mincha ketana. What's the source? Where do you see that in the sacrifices? This is the Tosfos ad plag ha-mincha. So Tosfos asks this question, and he says, you know what it is? Rabbi Yehuda says that there is a sacrifice. It's not brought on the outside altar, but there is a sacrifice that's brought after, in connection with the afternoon sacrifice, called the incense. The incense was brought on the inner altar. And that sacrifice, the inner incense that was brought on the inner altar, that was brought right after the afternoon service, and it was brought on the inner altar, and it was done right afterwards, and it made sense. It would be approximately an hour. That type of so that would end approximately 1.25 hours, before the end of the day. So Tosfos says that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, that you have until plag ha-mincha, because Rabbi Yehuda includes the ketores as one of the main parts, as part of the afternoon sacrifices, and it was a daily sacrifice. It was done in the morning and in the afternoon, the ketores, and therefore it was that is what the afternoon service corresponds to. And if you think about it, when we say the karbanos for mincha, what do we say? What are the paragraphs that we recite before the afternoon service? Those people who say the karbanos, what do they say? We say the daily Talmud paragraph, and we also say the ketores paragraph, because those are the two parts, so to speak, of the daily sacrifice. And first we read the Talmud. First we read the daily paragraph, and then afterwards we read the ketores, which is the incense paragraph, because that was brought always after the carbon Talmud, after the daily sacrifice. So now when we recite the karbanos, the sacrifices in the afternoon, now you have a little understanding of that. There's an opinion, Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that it really corresponds to the Ketores. Now, of course, we go until night, but even our time of mincha, it includes our mincha corresponds to the the main sacrifice. But we see Rabbi Yehuda somehow connects the Ketores as if it's part of this Talmud, this daily sacrifice, and because it was daily, and so we recite both of those for the sacrifices.
Okay. So that sounds like mincha is not necessarily up until sunset. Mincha is going according to the number of hours in the day.
Well, again, Rabbi Yehuda says that you have until an hour and a quarter before the end of the day. Rabbi Yehuda follows the fact when it was practically brought, not when it's allowed to be brought. And it was practically brought at that time, and therefore he says that's when you have until to say mincha. Now the rabbis go by the permissibility of it being brought, which it could have been brought until the night, or on rare occasions it was. So maybe the rabbis go by either when it's allowed or when it sometimes seldomly was brought, and therefore they hold it's until night.
Rabbi?
Yes, Phyllis.
What did you say was the first one, the first part of it was the shechita, the slaughtering, and the third one was the sprinkling, the sprika. But what is the second one?
So shechita, Kabbalah, which is accepting the blood, receiving the blood. And then halacha is bringing the blood to the altar. And then zrika is sprinkling the blood. One of the practical applications of these avodos, these services that were done, is that you had to have the right intention, which sacrifice you're bringing it for, and that you're going to be eating the meat at the time that it's allowed. So you have to have the right intentions during each of these four avodas, for the four services that were done with with each sacrifice. Okay, now we're going to continue with the next Gemara. We're now four lines up from the bottom of the page. Rabbi Yehuda. Yeah.
Page, is this on 20, what page are we on now?
26b.
Thank you.
26b, 4 lines up from the bottom of the page. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer ad arba shoy. So now Rabbi Yehuda said that Shachris you have until 4 hours. Now in English, the word until generally means up until, but not including. And if you say the word through, THRU, it means up and until and including. So until and through are two separate words. In Hebrew, the word ad, until, sometimes means until and including. So, for example, if you would have a group of people and you say, or if you say like until the age of 15, you're allowed to do, until the age of 13, you're allowed to do a certain thing. So does until the age of 13 meaning until and including 13, or does it mean until 12 and from 13 and up is the different law? What is it, the word until, if you say until 13? So in Hebrew, it's always questionable, what does the word ad mean, until? In English, it would be pretty much until and up until, but not including. But in Hebrew, it would need to be clarified. And that's why there's a term called ad viad bichlal, until and including. And there's a term called ad v'loyad bichlal, until but not including. So the word ad could mean both. So now Rabbi Yehuda says that you're allowed to daven shacharis, the morning prayer, until the 4th hour of the day. So for example, let's take the simple day that starts at 6 a.m. sunrise and it ends at 6 p.m. sunset. So you have a 6 to 6 day. What does it mean you have until the 4th hour to daven shacharis? does it mean until 9 o'clock or until 10 o'clock? Because the 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, you have the first 3 hours, and then you have the fourth hour would be 9 to 10. That would be the fourth hour of the day, would be from 9 to 10. Is when you say you can daven until the fourth hour, does it mean including the 9 to 10? Do you have until 10 or do you have only until 9? That's the Gemara's question. So let me read it inside. They asked the question, the people of the yeshiva, the students, they asked the question, what does Rabbi Yehuda mean when he says until the fourth hour? Ad v'yad b'chlal, dilma ad v'layad b'chlal. Does he mean until and including the fourth hour, or until but not including the fourth hour? The Gemara now is going to try to prove from different places in our Mishnah and in a Brisa, what does it mean when you say until, and does it mean including or not including? Tashima, come and listen. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad plaga mincha. Rabbi Yehuda says you have until halfway through mincha. That's when you can daven mincha until plaga mincha. Now, what do you think that means? Until that halfway. Now, we divided mincha in half. Mincha is a 2.5 hour. Mincha ketana is a 2.5 hour time period, from 9.5 hours in the day until the end of the day, until 12 hours in the day, which means the end of the day, sunset. Every day is 12 hours. So you have from 9.5 hours, which on a day from 6 to 6 would be 3:30. From 3:30 until 6 would be mincha ketana, and half of that would be until you have until half of it would mean until 10 hours and 10 3/4 hours, which would be until 4:45. Until 4:45, you can daven mincha, according to Rabbi Yehuda. On this day, that's 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. What does he mean? You have until halfway through mincha. So when he says until there, he means until the second half of mincha, right? So does that mean including the second half of mincha, or does that mean up and until but not including? Again, he says you have until halfway through mincha to daven mincha. Does he mean until, up and until but not including, or does he mean including that second half of mincha, and you really have until sunset? What do you think? Does he mean until but not including, and you have until 4:45, or does he mean you have until and including, you have until the second half of mincha and including it until 6 p.m.? What does he mean until?
It says
Ben?
continuously.
Ben?
If it doesn't say bichlal, then it's not including.
Right. So
But
Ben
in
says it.
modern Hebrew, we have a word for it.
What did
We
that
have
be?
kolel.
Kolel.
We have the word kolel or ad asher. And ad asher includes the number that you're saying.
Oh, really? Interesting. Ad asher.
But here they're using bichlal. Yeah.
Okay. So Ben says that Rabbi Yehuda for sure means ad v'loyad b'chlal, until but not including. That's Ben's understanding, and I think it makes sense what Ben is saying logically. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? What is ad? What does it mean in Rabbi Yehuda's statement? Does he mean and including that second half of mincha, or does he mean until but not including? Susan, did you want to say something?
There's a word continuously.
Yeah, but continuously would mean you could daven mincha even at night, or you could daven the next morning. I'm not going to use that word. That's not a good word here. The word maybe you could say the word through, thru, that through plaga mincha, which would mean until and including. Until the fourth hour, you could say through the fourth hour, which would mean until and including. But in Hebrew, the word ad could mean both. It could mean this way and it could mean that way. So we have to decide, what does the word ad mean? So Rabbi Yehuda, the Gemara says, he says until halfway through mincha. I amrit bishleima. It's good if you say ad v'loyad b'chlal. Ad, until, means until but not including. Hainu deika bein Rabbi Yehuda l'Rabbanan. Then there is a difference between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. The rabbis say you have until 6 p.m., until sunset. And Rabbi Yehuda says you have until Plag HaMincha, until, but not including that half of Mincha. You have until the second half of Mincha, but you don't have including the second half of Mincha. So it would make sense, he says until, but not including. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says 4:45 is the deadline. The rabbis say 6 p.m. is the deadline. That would make sense. But what's going to happen if you do read it the other way? Ela'i amrit ad viad b'chlal. If you're going to say,
After the class.
if you're going to say that ad means until and including through Plag HaMincha, Rabbi Yehuda hainu Rabbanan. That would be that Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis would be saying the same thing. And we see in the Bryce in the Mishnah that they're arguing. The Mishnah clearly says this is the opinion of this rabbi, that's the opinion of the others. So therefore, it's clearly there's an argument. And if he means ad viad b'chlal, until and including through Plag HaMincha, he would basically be saying you have until night, until sunset. You have until and including that second half of Mincha. So that can't be. Therefore, the Gemara seems to understand pretty clearly that ad, until, means until, but not including. Now the Gemara says, no, not good. We have another source that implies the opposite. Elamai, rather, what are you going to say? We're now on page 27a. 27a, the top line. Elamai, what are you going to say? Ad v'loyad b'chlal. So until means not including. Ema seifa, let's say the end of either the Mishnah or the Brisa. There's a different opinions if this is a Mishnah or a Brisa. But in the end, it says that v'shel musafin kol hayoim, musaf you have all day, and Rabbi Yehuda said ad sheva shois, you have until 7 hours. Now, the Gemara is going to bring now a brisa that tells us that there is a scenario where you have mincha and musaf, and you're not sure which one to daven first. This actually does happen on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. On Rosh Hashanah, we daven very late. By the time we daven musaf, it's often after midday, and sometimes it's even after a half hour after midday. Takes a lot of time. They sell the aliyahs. They try to do an appeal in shul when everyone comes to shul. And the service is also a little long, a little extra long. And therefore, sometimes you'll come into a scenario where it's time for mincha and it's time for musaf. Now, what happens in that case? Which one do you daven first? Anyone remember from Yom Kippur? Which prayer do you daven first, musaf or mincha? So in shul, we daven musaf first. We always daven musaf first. But according to halacha, according to the letter of the law, and the same thing would apply if you were davening alone, and it was that time of the day where you could daven both, you really should daven mincha first. Because mincha is more usual, it's more often. And you normally do the more often prayer first before the seldom prayer. The prayer that you do regularly, you do more often, you do it first. This plays a role when it comes to the Torah readings. What's the order of the Torah readings? For example, Rosh Chodesh and Chanukah. How often is Rosh Chodesh happen during the year? We have 12 Rosh Chodeshes or 13, and sometimes it's a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. So you can have like 18 days of Rosh Chodesh. How many days of Hanukkah are there? 8. So what's more often, Rosh Chodesh or Hanukkah? Rosh Chodesh. So therefore, when it comes to reading the Torah, when Rosh Chodesh and Hanukkah fall out together, which Torah reading do you do first? If I'm not mistaken, you do Rosh Chodesh first, and the reason would be because it's more often. And after, at the end of the Rosh Chodesh, you do the Hanukkah reading, because you do the more often, more usual, more regular thing first. Same thing would apply to Mincha and Musaf, according to the letter of the law. We don't do this in Shul. When you have a minyan, it's put down in Shulchan Aruch that you don't do this with a minyan because you don't want to make a mistake. You don't want people to make a mistake. But basically, if you were davening alone, you would daven Mincha before Musaf. Now let's think for a moment Reb Yehuda's opinion. Reb Yehuda holds that you're supposed to daven Musaf until the 7th hour. When is the 7th hour? The 7th hour on a day that's 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., the 7th hour is from 12 o'clock, from noon until 1 o'clock. That is the 7th hour. Noon is chatzos, midday, and then the 7th hour would be from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock. When is the earliest time that you could daven mincha on a day that's 6 a.m. to 6 p.m.? When is the earliest time you could daven mincha? The earliest time you could daven mincha, 12:30. Thank you, Ben. 12:30. 6.5 hours in the day, 12:30. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says you have until the 7th hour to daven musaf. So mincha you could daven until 12:30. Musaf, we're not sure what Rabbi Yehuda means. He means until the 7th hour. Does he mean until the 7th hour, which would mean 12? Or does he mean until 1 o'clock, which means until and including the 7th hour? He either means until 12 o'clock you could daven musaf, or it means until 1 o'clock you could daven musaf. It depends what the word ad means, until. What does the word ad mean? When we say it in the Mishnah or in the Brisa, does the word ad mean until and including, or does it mean until? Now, if until means until but not including, according to Rabbi Yehuda, would you ever have a scenario where you can either daven mincha and musaf, and we have to decide which one should you do first? If Rabbi Yehuda says musaf has to be davened before 12, then you never have a scenario of mincha and musaf. Which one should you daven first? Because musaf you're supposed to daven until 12, and mincha you start davening from 12:30. So in that case, there is no option of davening 2 prayers. The only case that's possible to daven that you would have, the case where you would have a possibility that you need to daven both prayers and you don't know which one to do first, mincha or musaf, is if Rabbi Yehuda says until 7 hours, he means until and including the 7th hour. If he means until and including the 7th hour, that means you have until 1 o'clock to daven musaf. So when 12:30 comes around and you didn't daven musaf yet, and you say, 12:30, I could either daven mincha and musaf, which one should I do now? That would be a scenario where Rabbi Yehuda would have such a question. And we see that Rabbi Yehuda has an opinion about musaf and mincha, which one should you daven first? And therefore, it must be that, according to his view, there is a possibility of having of mincha and a musaf, and he has to decide which one. So how must we explain the word ad? We must say that when he says you have until the 7th hour, the word until means until and including the 7th hour. So that's the Gemara's conclusion. So we earlier said that the word ad until means until but not including, because we had a proof from Plaga Mincha that if until and including, then Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis would be the same view. So we concluded a minute ago that until means until but not including. And that had to do with the final time for Mincha. We proved from that final time, the deadline for Mincha, that until means until but not including. Now the Gemara says, until by Musaf, you see that until means until and including. because Rabbi Yehuda says you have until the 7th hour, and he also talks about a case where you have to daven mincha and musaf at the same time. So when he says until the 7th hour, he must mean until the 7th hour and including the 7th hour you daven musaf. And therefore you have a scenario where you would have mincha and musaf, and you have to decide which one to do first. So earlier we had a proof until means until but not including, and now we have a proof until means until and including. So now we have a contradiction. What does the word until mean? And this all boils down to the question, what does he mean when he talks about the morning service? Do you have until the 4th hour, or until and including the 4th hour, or until and not including the 4th hour? So we're all taking these two untils and we're trying to connect them with the previous word until when he talks about the Shachar service. What does he mean then when he says until? Do you have until 9 a.m. to say Shachris, to do the morning service, or do you have until 10 a.m. to do the morning service? So that is what the Gemara is trying to explain. And now let's read it inside. So we have the Rabbi Yehuda says until the 7 hours you have to daven musaf. Again, we hold you can daven a whole day musaf, but the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and it could be I'm not sure if it's preferable to follow that. I would have to look it up in Shulchan Aruch about musaf, but if it's preferable to try to do it within the 7th hour. But the Gemara is going to deal with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion here. And Rabbi Yehuda says you have until the 7th hour to daven musaf, and we don't know what that means. Until the 7th hour. Does it mean until and including? Until noon, until 1 o'clock? Or does it mean until and not including until noon? Vitanya, and we have a brisa. Hayu lafanav shtei tfilas. A person has 2 prayers, and they're not sure which one to do first. Achas shel musaf, v'achas shel mincha. You have the musaf prayer in front of you, and you have the mincha prayer in front of you. Mispalal shel mincha, you should daven mincha first, v'achakach shel musaf, and afterwards you do the musaf. Shazu tadira v'zu ena tadira, because this is more usual and common. The other one is not as common, and therefore you should daven mincha first. Again, as I mentioned, this is referring to a case where you're davening alone, not in a shul. In a shul, you never do this, but alone, this would be the halacha maybe that you would daven mincha and then musaf. Rabbi Yehuda says mispalel shel musaf v'yachakach shel mincha. You should daven musaf. And afterwards, mincha shazu ayveres v'zu ena ayveres. The reason you should daven musaf first, Rabbi Yehuda says, is because you're going to soon lose the time. It's going to be too late. You're not going to be able to daven musaf anymore because I hold you have until the 7th hour. This one is going to pass, and the other one is not going to pass. Mincha you have until night. Musaf you have only until 7 hours. Now, what does he mean until 7 hours? Does he mean until noon? Until the beginning of the 7th hour, or until and including the 7th? It's good if you say ad bi'ad b'chlal until and including the 7th hour. This is how it would work out, that you would find a potential situation, a scenario that you have 2 prayers together at the same time. It's 12:30 in the afternoon, and you can either daven mincha or musaf. This is how you have it, because Rabbi Yehuda says ad bi'ad b'chlal until the 7th hour, and including the 7th hour, you really have until 1 o'clock to daven musaf, and the time for mincha has already come, and so you don't know which one to do. So it's possible you have both. You could have both prayers now. Between 12:30 and 1 is a time to say both prayers, musaf and mincha. Ella but amrit, if you will say ad v'loyad b'chlal, that when he says until the 7th hour, he means until, but not including the 7th hour. You have until noon to daven musaf, and you have from 12:30 p.m. to daven mincha. Heichi mishkachas lahu. How will you find a scenario that you'll have shtei tfilos b'hadei hadadi, that you'll have 2 prayers at the same time? How will you have such a scenario? Musaf you had to finish by noon, and mincha only begins at 12:30. So you don't have a scenario of 2 prayers at the same time. Rather, we must say that until 7 hours means until and including. So when it came to plaga mincha, Rabbi Yehuda said until plaga mincha meant until but not including. When it comes to musaf, when he says until the 7th hour, it means until and including. This is quite contradictory. What? He should make a blanket word. Not it's so vague. One place it says it means one way, one place it means the other way. And the Gemara explains itself. Kivan da asyol shel mincha, asyol azla shel musafit. And once mincha came, musaf left. Musaf left at 12 o'clock, and mincha came. If mincha's around, then there's no musaf anymore. And so, what does this mean? So elamai ad v'ad b'chlal. So what are you going to say? Must mean until 7th hour, means until and including the 7th hour. That's how you have the case, a scenario of both prayers at the same time. So the Gemara says, but what about the earlier thing? Kasha Reisha. Now we have a question from the beginning. The beginning, it said until Plaga Mincha, and we said it must mean until, but not including. Because if you say until Plaga Mincha means until and including the second half of Mincha, that would mean that he says you could daven my Mincha until night, which would be the same opinion as the rabbis. It must be that until means until, but not including. So we have a contradiction from the beginning of the Mishnah to the end of the Mishnah. So the Gemara answers, I'm sorry, I skipped a few words. Kasha Reisha, my Ika bein Rabbi Yehuda l'Rabbanan. What would be the difference between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis? It must be that until in the Reisha, which means until and not including. Because otherwise, what will be the difference between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis? So now the Gemara answers, I'll give you a simple answer. When Rabbi Yehuda says until, he always means until and including. How are we going to answer the Plag HaMincha, the halfway through Mincha? He says until Plag HaMincha. He can't mean until and including Plag HaMincha, because then that would be the same opinion as the rabbis, until and including the second half of Mincha. The Gemara says, no, it doesn't mean until the second half of Mincha. It means until the first half of Mincha. We never thought about this. It means until the first half of Mincha, until the time of Mincha Ketana, the 9.5 hours in the day, until that first half of Mincha, and including it until midway. Until the first half and including it. We thought we meant until the second half and not including it. No, we mean until the first half of Mincha, which means 9.5 hours in the day. Until then, you can daven Mincha, and including that first half of Mincha, another hour and a quarter, which means until 10 3/4 hours. So when he says ad, he always means until and including. So the Gemara says, "Mi sabras ta'ai plaga mincha plaga achreina kamar." Who says that when he says until halfway through mincha, he means the second half? Plag rishoina kamar. He means the first half. V'hari kamar. And this is what he means to say, Rabbi Yehuda says, you can daven mincha until and including the first half. Emas nafik plag rishoina. When does the first half leave? Ayol plag achroina and comes in the last half. Michinafti yud aleph shoyis chaser ravia. When you finish 11 hours minus a quarter, which means 10 3/4 hours into the day, which means 4:45. If the day has 12 hours, it's from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and the 10 3/4 hours into the day would be 4:45. That's when you have until to daven mincha. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying you have until and including the first half of that mincha, including that, which would mean not only do you have 9.5 hours in the day, but you also have, including the first half of mincha, which is another hour and a quarter, you have until and including that until 10 3/4 hours in the day, which means 4:45. And that is the conclusion of the Gemara. Interesting that the word ad means until and including. And what this means is in the morning, it gives us an extra hour to daven, because it means you have until the 4th hour of the day. It means you have until and including the 4th hour of the day, which means Shema, you have until the 3rd hour of the day. Shemona Esrei, the prayer, you have until the 4th hour and including the 4th hour. So you got an extra hour to daven, because until, the word until means until and including. Yes, David.
When you're saying it's musaf, it's in the additional prayer, it's considered additional to the particular day, let's say Shabbos or Rosh Chodesh, but is it additional to Shachris or not necessarily? Like, in other words, is there a relationship between musaf and Shachris? Could a person decide well, let's have this shul's going to daven their musaf by mincha. Like, like it seems to be, it's connected to Shachris rather than some other time.
I'm not really sure. I don't understand exactly the question. What do you mean?
Like, in other words, the idea of an additional prayer that we call musaf, it's connected to the day, whether it's Shabbos or Yontif or Rosh Chodesh, but it's additional to the day. Is it an addition to Shachris or not necessarily?
Is it specifically connected to Shachris?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know that it is. I mean, there is a discussion if you're, about not interrupting between Shachris and Musaf. There is such a concept of not making Kiddush. I'd have to look it up and see if it mentions anything about there's a discussion. Do you have to make Kiddush before, in between Shachris and Musaf? Are you allowed to make Kiddush then? And so maybe that could be connected to your question. I'm not really sure, but we obviously, it doesn't have the time frame of Shachris it's not connected to that. That's for sure. And because it has a different schedule, and it's not, it's not based on the Shachris schedule, and it's basically all day according to the rabbis. You could daven Musaf from the morning to the afternoon. So anyway, I guess we could look up and see if that maybe that'll help you about eating in between or separating in between Shachris and Musaf. We'll have to take a look. Okay, Susan, you had a question?
I was just curious who actually performed the sacrifices. What was the name of the person?
The Kohen, the priests, and they would actually do a raffle. I'm sorry?
Not the rabbi.
No, not rabbis, priests, the Kohen, from the family of Aaron, the Kohen, Moses' brother, Aaron, there are many of them. Even today, there are many people. They get those that are called up to the Torah first. They're called the Kohen. They're the Kohens.
I see.
They would do the perform, and they would make some type of a lottery to choose who would be the people who merited. They would, to bring because there was a lot of them wanted to participate.
Right.
It was divided into many groups, but even within the groups, there was still so many.
Right.
Okay. Have a wonderful.